Happy day after Christmas. I hope you are enjoying your holiday season with family and friends. I'm curious, have you taken some time to really reflect with God over this year before you go rushing into 2024? I certainly did, as I do every year. And I want to share with you a little bit about one of the top four lessons from 2023. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Kingdom Over Everything. I am your host and Chief Fire Igniter, Shae Bynes. I want to kick this off with a clip from a broadcast that happened on a Spanish-speaking broadcasting network with Dr. Myles Munroe, and this was shortly before his tragic death. I'm just going to share 1 minute from this few minutes clips. Take a look at this.
The greatest act of leadership
El acto más grande del liderazgo,
is what happens in your absence.
¿qué pasa en tu ausencia?
If everything you've done died with you,
Si todo lo que tú has hecho muere contigo,
you are a failure.
eres un fracasado.
True leaders
Es por eso que verdaderos líderes
don't invest in buildings.
no invierten en edificios.
Jesus never built a building.
Jesús nunca construyó un edificio.
They invest in people.
Ellos invierten en personas, en gente.
Why?
¿Por qué?
Because success
Porque éxito
without a successor
sin uno que le suceda después
is failure.
es fracaso.
True leaders
Verdaderos líderes
make themselves
se hacen a ellos mismos
unnecessary.
que son innecesarios.
A true leader
Un verdadero líder
work themselves out of a job.
trabajan de tal manera que se quedan sin trabajo.
So great leaders
Grandes líderes
measure their greatness
se miden su grandeza.
by their absence.
When I first heard this message from Dr. Myles Munroe nearly a decade ago, it really resonated in my heart. And by the way, if you want to hear the full 3.5 minutes of this message, check out the link in the show notes so you can watch the whole thing. But this resonated with me so much because I was a co-founder. I am a co-founder of a movement called Kingdom Driven Entrepreneur, which started in 2012. The business that supports that movement is called Kingdom Driven LLC, so I'm an owner of that business. But the Lord shifted me out of the CEO position of that business at the end of 2020. And even in the very early days, he spoke to my heart about how this was a movement that wasn't going to be a guru movement. This wasn't like an expert-led movement. It wasn't to be centered around me or centered around my co-founder, who was actively involved for the first couple of years. But it wasn't meant to be centered around us. It was meant to be centered around him. And so everything points back to him. And so I knew that what this was a kingdom movement that needed to have longevity well beyond me. So I knew that from the beginning. And then in 2019, he really began to speak to my heart about developing people and being prepared. I didn't know that I was going to be leaving the position anytime really soon, but I started really pouring into people more and, pulling people into more responsibility and all of those things. And I didn't realize that it was not going to be very long before he was going to call me out of that CEO seat. So it has been about 3 years since I haven't been the CEO, but have served as an executive advisor for the company and the movement. And I got to tell you, it has not been an easy process. Legacy-minded leadership is absolutely essential, but it ain't easy. And I would have thought that the third year would have been a charm, and it wasn't. Right. And so there's so much to this whole thing around really pouring into people and also being willing, especially when you're a founder, being willing to be open-handed, to let go, to position what you're doing, whether it's a business, whether it's a ministry, to position it to function and operate well beyond you. And so even though that was my heart, and even though that's exactly where I knew we needed to be, being on the other side of that and walking that out as an executive advisor who can advise, but can't really, can't exactly make the decision. The decision belongs to somebody else now. I can only advise. That whole dynamic takes a lot of growth. It takes a lot of growth, especially when you're still an owner of the business, right? So it has been such a interesting, and I mean that in good ways and also not so great ways, journey for me over these past few years. And one of the things that I learned this particular year, and this year 3 of being on the other side of that, is that I have to really go deeper in my trust in God. And so, what I've been challenged to do a little bit better year over year is figure out the right places to be, the right places to speak, the right places to be seen. Where is it important for me to show up, and how do I do that? How do I do that effectively? That's in line with what God desires to see happening in this movement. I'm still supposed to be involved, just in different ways. And so, finding that balance and being able to do that with open hands and fully trusting God, and trusting God within all of the people who are faithful and committed to moving this movement forward. It's a process. It really is. And so I thank God for mentors and advisors that I have who help me to navigate that adventure of being a legacy-minded leader. You have to be willing to do the things that are necessary to walk that thing out. And I'm not talking about, Dr. Myles Munroe was talking about that legacy in terms of your death. For me, it's not the legacy for death. It was a legacy of me not being the CEO anymore. It was that level of legacy. I prayerfully would be alive for many, 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 many years as I watch and engage in this movement and in this company moving forward. But I'm here. I'm not gone, right? And so there's various dynamics to that. Now, I actually just recently saw this clip with Dave Ramsey, and the host was saying to him, "Hey, I heard, that you are going to be you're planning for your retirement." And he asked him about that. And listen to something that Dave shared. Watch this.
We've heard some news that you are considering retiring soon.
You did?
I did.
When we started, it was like, okay, I'm producing all the revenue. And so if I die today, what happens to all these employees? Well, they're screwed. And we said, okay, then we need to measure non-Dave revenue. It's very hard to find somebody who's done a brand transfer like ours. Paul Harvey Jr. very seldom can take Paul Harvey's seat. But we did figure out a one-to-many had a chance. I didn't put the whole thing on my daughter, Rachel Cruz's shoulders. We have now raised up a George Camel and a Jade Warshaw and a Ken Coleman. So if Rachel is going and doing a book, that's non-Dave revenue. Or if Ken Coleman goes to speak somewhere, that speaking fee is a non-Dave revenue, right? We wanted it to be a 50% of the revenue was not mine. And the great news is that in 2023, we're at about 78%.
No way.
If I'm not here. We built the business models out in such a way that it's not Dave dependent to continue to run. For instance, our high school curriculum is a $15, $20 million business. They don't care if I'm alive or not.
And so that is part of the journey as well. And, again, Dave's even referring to that legacy, like if I died, what would happen, right? And so having to think about, that's been the process that I've been going through, and not just about death, but just being on the other side of being the one who's the host of the podcast, which I did for 9.5 years, and stopped in March of this year, no longer being, the face per se. And so, and what does that look like? But how can I make sure that my mark is where it needs to be? That helps to drive movement forward. And also from a business perspective, also drives revenue and profitability for us to continue to go and for us to continue to thrive as God has called us to do with this movement, right? What does that look like? How much of it is Shae dependent, right? And so there's just been such a process in doing this, but I really want to encourage you that if God's really put this on your heart, to be really thinking about legacy, not just legacy for what would happen if you died tomorrow. That's important too. But even legacy around you not in this position anymore. Because that the thing that God called you to is bigger than you. I mean, especially if God's called you to a movement can't continue to move if it's centered around personality and an individual. There has to be, it's like, what is God calling? What's the message? What's the thing that God's pulling together. That's right at the center of this movement. There has to be others. There has to be other voices. It has to be able to thrive beyond you. And so I just want to encourage you as you're closing this year, that if that's something God's really put on your heart, to really seek God around, what does that expression look like? What should be my next step of focus to ensure that I'm taking steps towards being legacy minded with this business, with this ministry? What does that look like? What's the next step? And also encourage you, if you haven't done any reflections of this year that will help you to really be in gratitude, as well as see what might you need to start or stop or shift going into the new year, I encourage you to spend some time with God to do that reflection. Sometimes it's really easy to just dig right into, I'm goal setting. I'm going to go goal setting for the year ahead. But don't rush to do that without spending time reflecting, because there's so much that you can actually get out of your reflection that will inform your way forward in 2024. And if you want to read all of my top 4 lessons from 2023, I've got that link in the show notes and you can check that out too. I'll talk to you next week.